The air in Amsterdam in March 1971 was biting. It wasn't the kind of cold that just sits on your skin. It was a damp, creeping chill that found its way through heavy coats and settled deep into your bones. But if you were inside that warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the cold didn't matter. The heat was generated by something else entirely. A mix of aggression, anticipation, and the thick, suffocating smell of stale sweat, leather, and years of accumulated violence. This wasn't a stadium. There were no bright lights, no fanfare, no ringing bells or cheering throngs of fans in the thousands. This was a private exhibition, a secret gathering of people who knew the real meaning of the word fight. The room was packed, the walls lined with men, mostly Dutch kickboxers, hard-nosed guys with cauliflower ears and calloused knuckles, who had come for one reason: to see the local legend do what she did best. They were waiting for Saskia. In the center of the room sat a boxing ring that had seen better days. The ropes were sagging, a bit loose, and the canvas was a tapestry of dark, permanent stains, blood, sweat, and spit from 100 unsanctioned wars. For the people crowded around the perimeter, this was their cathedral, and their queen, Saskia Vanderberg, was about to hold court. Saskia was 28 years old, a product of the docks of Rotterdam. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a force of nature. Standing 6'2" and weighing in at a solid, dense 240 pounds, she was terrifying. This wasn't fitness muscle, this was functional, hard-won mass built through years of brutal training. She had been the only girl in a gym full of men since she was 15, and she had spent the last decade proving every single one of them wrong. By 22, she held the heavyweight championship, not the women's division, but the actual heavyweight division. She fought men, and more often than not, she sent them to the hospital. She walked into the space with the swagger of someone who had never had to doubt her physical dominance. She wore black shorts and a tight sports top, her massive shoulders and thick, tree-trunk thighs visible to everyone in the room. When she moved, you could see the power in her gait. She was a woman who had never faced a physical problem she couldn't solve with a well-placed kick. To the crowd, she was proof that the Dutch were the toughest, the hardest, the most lethal fighters in Europe. Then, there was the other side of the ring. When the side door opened and Bruce Lee stepped through, the room didn't just get quiet, it got awkward. There was a weird, buzzing energy in the air, a collective confusion that turned into a ripple of hushed laughter. Bruce looked entirely out of place. He was 5'7", maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. To these Dutch fighters, he looked like a gust of wind could knock him over. He wasn't wearing a robe. He wasn't doing a dramatic walkout. He just walked in wearing simple black shorts and a plain expression. He was a Chinese-American actor, a movie star. Most of the people in that room had never even heard of him, and those who had only knew him from whatever rumors had drifted over from Hong Kong. They saw the height difference, the weight gap, over 100 pounds of pure, dense muscle separating them, and they started to smirk. It was a mismatch. It was a joke. A few guys in the back shouted something in Dutch, a sharp jab that made the crowd chuckle. The sentiment was clear. This isn't a fight. It's a public execution. They expected the movie star to be a pushover. They expected Saskia to toy with him, maybe let him dance around for a few seconds to build the tension, before she inevitably ended it with one of those legendary, rib-cracking low kicks that had put countless men on the floor. Bruce didn't acknowledge the laughter. He didn't look at the crowd. He just climbed through the ropes and stood in his corner, his gaze fixed, his body language oddly loose. He looked small, almost fragile. When he stood next to Saskia for the pre-fight instructions, the disparity was almost comedic. She towered over him, her arms thick enough to snap his neck, her expression unreadable, but clearly annoyed that she was wasting her time. But if you looked closer, if you were one of the few people there who actually knew what they were looking at, you would have noticed something in Bruce's eyes. He wasn't scared. He wasn't intimidated by the sheer wall of muscle in front of him. He was observant. He was taking in everything, the way she stood, the way she shifted her weight, the tension in her hands. He wasn't there to fight a heavyweight. He was there to test a philosophy. The air was thick with expectation, but it was the wrong kind of expectation. The crowd was waiting for a spectacle of brute force, a crushing victory for their local hero. They were about to witness something that would break their understanding of what fighting actually was. They were about to learn that in the world of violence, mass isn't the only equation. As the referee stepped into the center to give the rules, the room finally fell into a tense, heavy silence. The smell of the warehouse seemed to intensify. The cold from the Dutch winter outside pressed against the walls, but inside, the temperature was rising. This was the moment where the legend of that night truly began, not with a punch, but with the silence before the storm, the calm moment when everyone in the room thought they knew how the next few minutes would play out. They were all wrong. Saskia tapped her massive glove against Bruce's. Her knuckles were scarred, built for shattering bone. His were smaller, polished, showing a different kind of history. They walked back to their corners, and for a fleeting second, it was just the two of them. One, a giant of European kickboxing, the pride of the local scene. The other, an enigma, a man who believed that the mind was the ultimate weapon. The bell rang. The sound echoed through the warehouse, sharp and sudden, slicing. They were about to learn that in the world of violence, mass isn't the only equation. As the referee stepped into the center to give the rules, the room finally fell into a tense, heavy silence. The smell of the warehouse seemed to intensify. The cold from the Dutch winter outside pressed against the walls. But inside, the temperature was rising. This was the moment where the legend of that night truly began, not with a punch, but with the silence before the storm. The calm moment when everyone in the room thought they knew how the next few minutes would play out. They were all wrong. Saskia tapped her massive glove against Bruce's. Her knuckles were scarred, built for shattering bone. His were smaller, polished, showing a different kind of history. They walked back to their corners, and for a fleeting second, it was just the two of them. One, a giant of European kickboxing, the pride of the local scene. The other, an enigma, a man who believed that the mind was the ultimate weapon. The bell rang. The sound echoed through the warehouse, sharp and sudden, slicing through the tension. It was time. The laughter from the crowd died instantly, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. In that singular moment, the world outside, the city of Amsterdam, the cold, the politics, ceased to exist. There was only the ring, the canvas, and two very different ideas about what it meant to fight. The bell rang. It wasn't a long, drawn-out sound. It was sharp, metallic, and final. In a fraction of a second, the laughter that had been bubbling in the warehouse died out, choked off by the sudden reality of the situation. Saskia didn't wait. She didn't bother with a formal stance or a respectful distance. She knew her advantage, and she was there to use it. She exploded forward. It was a terrifying sight. 240 pounds of pure, conditioned rage closing the distance in a heartbeat. She launched a low kick, the kind of strike that had crippled seasoned kickboxers in Amsterdam for years. It was a right low kick, aimed directly at Bruce's lead leg. It was built with the full weight of her entire body, a kinetic release that could snap a baseball bat in half. The sound of her shin cutting through the air was visceral, a heavy, whistling thwack that made the people in the front row flinch. That kick was designed to be the end of the conversation. But Bruce wasn't there. Well, he was, but he wasn't there. He didn't retreat. He didn't try to backpedal, which would have been the natural, panicked response for a smaller man against a charging heavyweight. Instead, he did the one thing that made no sense to anyone watching. He moved into the space she had vacated. He checked the kick, not by absorbing the impact like a wall, but by meeting it with his own shin, shin to shin. And then, in a move that defied the physics the Dutch crowd understood, he pivoted. He didn't absorb the force, he redirected it. It was like watching a bull charge at a matador, only for the bull to find nothing but empty air. As Saskia's leg began to retract, her balance momentarily compromised by the sheer momentum of her own missed strike, Bruce stepped inside her guard. He didn't swing a haymaker. He didn't throw a wild hook. He just fired a straight, short punch to her ribs. It traveled maybe 6 inches. It looked lazy to the untrained eye. But the sound? The sound was a sharp, sickening crack. The noise of a fist meeting bone with perfect alignment. The room went dead silent. Saskia's eyes went wide. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at an opponent with contempt. She was looking at him with pure, unadulterated shock. She had taken hits from men who weighed 260 pounds. She had taken punishment that would have sidelined a lesser fighter. But this was different. This wasn't just force, it was penetration. It felt like he had bypassed her muscles entirely and struck the ribcage underneath. She grunted, a sharp, ragged sound that escaped her lips before she could stop it. Her forward momentum stopped dead. She took a step back, not a tactical retreat, but an involuntary stumble. Her body was trying to figure out what just happened. She had been hit, and it hurt in a way that wasn't just pain. It was an intrusion. The crowd, which had been so eager to see the movie star get dismantled, suddenly had nothing to say. A few guys in the back shifted uncomfortably. The laughter was gone. The atmosphere shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, from a spectacle to a genuine, dangerous contest. Bruce didn't chase her. He didn't jump on her. He didn't throw a follow-up combo. He didn't try to finish it while she was off balance. He simply reset. He went back to his stance, hands loose, feet light, looking as calm as if he were practicing in a park. He stood there, watching her, waiting for her next move. He wasn't playing the game of who is bigger. He was playing a completely different sport. Saskia stared at him. She was breathing slightly harder, not from fatigue, but from the adrenaline spike of realizing she was in a fight that was rapidly spinning out of her control. She shifted her weight, testing her balance, checking to see if her ribs were still intact. She looked at Bruce, and for the first time she saw him, not as a movie star, not as a foreigner, but as a threat. The respect in her eyes was almost immediate. It was that cold, hard realization that comes when a champion realizes they are facing someone who understands the language of the fight better than they do. She decided to test him again. This time, she was careful. She threw a jab, a probing shot designed to gauge his distance and his reaction. Bruce didn't even blink. He slipped it by an inch, just enough to let the glove whistle past his ear. Then, she threw a right cross, a massive, clubbing blow that would have taken the head off a lesser man. Bruce ducked under it with the fluidity of water pouring through a sieve. Every move she made, he had an answer for. Not a counterattack, but a simple, efficient mitigation. She was putting in 100% of her effort, and he was putting in maybe 10% of his. And yet, she was the one being pushed back. The silence in the room was heavy now. It was the silence of people watching a magic trick and realizing it wasn't a trick at all. Saskia was the pride of their gym, the woman who had never been taken down. And here she was, being dismantled by a man who looked like he hadn't broken a sweat. The Dutch crowd, the guys who knew exactly how hard she hit, the guys who had seen her break ribs and concuss opponents, were watching in disbelief. They weren't cheering anymore. They were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. Bruce wasn't fighting like a kickboxer. He wasn't fighting like a boxer. He was fighting like he had decoded the very architecture of a human body and was simply dismantling it piece by piece. He moved with a grace that was alien to this gritty, concrete warehouse. He was fluid, he was unpredictable, and he was utterly, terrifyingly precise. He didn't just counter her punches, he countered her intent. Every time she thought about launching a strike, he was already there, disrupting her balance, checking her movement, cutting off her line of sight. It was a suffocating feeling, being fought like that. You felt like you were drowning on dry land. Saskia started to get frustrated. You could see it in her jaw, the way her teeth clenched. She wasn't used to frustration. She was used to domination. And the more she tried to force the fight, the more Bruce seemed to expand to fill the space, leaving her with no room to operate. The air in the room was growing thin. It was no longer just about the fight. It was about the power dynamic, the hierarchy of the room, the belief that the big, heavy, strong fighter always wins, was being systematically torn apart, blow by measured blow. The match was only getting started, but the outcome had already shifted. The question wasn't if Bruce could win anymore. It was how much longer Saskia could hold on before the reality of her own limitations crushed her spirit. She stood there, panting, looking at the man in front of her, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know what to do next. The stage was set. The myth of her invincibility was fading, replaced by the terrifying efficiency of a man who fought not with his body, but with his mind. And they were all just starting to see the true scale of the storm. The shift in the room was palpable. It wasn't just that Saskia had missed, it was that she had been neutralized. The air inside the warehouse, already heavy with the smell of old gym mats and damp winter air, grew dense with a new, sharper tension. For the first time, the men lining the walls, hardened fighters who lived for the crunch of bone, looked at Bruce not with amusement, but with a growing, gnawing sense of unease. They were seeing something that shouldn't have been possible. They were seeing a legend being dismantled, one small, measured movement at a time. Saskia, realizing that her brute force wasn't landing, took a deep breath. She had been fighting for years, and she was a student of the game. She knew how to adjust. Her expression tightened, her eyes narrowing as she shifted her strategy. She stopped lunging. She stopped throwing her entire weight into haymakers. She began to measure the distance, testing the air with a cautious, probing jab. She was looking for a gap, a moment of hesitation, a flaw in Bruce's rhythm she could exploit. But Bruce wasn't a puzzle you could solve by looking for flaws. He was the puzzle. He didn't retreat, and he didn't push. He just flowed. When she jabbed, he didn't block. He slipped, his head moving just enough to make her glove kiss the air. When she followed with a right cross, aiming to catch him on the transition, he dipped underneath it, his body coiling like a spring, and then he was gone, reappearing on her other side before she could even rotate her shoulder back to center. It was a lesson in the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, brought to life in a dusty Amsterdam warehouse. He wasn't fighting against her, he was using her own momentum against her. If she pushed, he yielded. If she retracted, he pressed. He was occupying the space she vacated, making it impossible for her to land a clean shot. She decided to throw a roundhouse kick, a high, sweeping arc aimed at his head. It was a beautiful, powerful strike, the kind that had finished half of her professional career. She put everything into it, the torque of her hips, the drive of her core, the absolute certainty of a fighter who had never been outmaneuvered. Bruce didn't duck. He didn't cover up. He stepped into the arc. In a move that defied the laws of the ring, he caught her leg mid-flight. He didn't just block it, he trapped it. The leg, heavy and solid as a tree trunk, was suddenly under his control. He didn't wrestle with it. He didn't try to power it down. He simply redirected the energy, sweeping her supporting leg while her balance was compromised by the kick. The sound was like a car crash. Saskia went down hard. When those 240 pounds hit the canvas, the entire ring frame groaned under the impact. The floorboards beneath the ring rattled. For a second, there was total silence. Not the quiet of a controlled room, but the stunned silence of a crowd that had just seen their reality shift. Their champion, the woman who had never even been taken to the mat, was lying on her back, staring up at the dim warehouse lights. The referee, a guy named Vanam who usually saw nothing but blood and sweat, stood over them, looking down with a face etched in pure disbelief. He started the count. 1. Saskia blinked, her mind scrambling to catch up with her body. 2. She pushed herself up, her palms flat against the dirty canvas. 3. She was rising, but she was shaky. Her equilibrium was off. She had been hit with the force of her own momentum, combined with the precision of Bruce's sweep. She looked at him. He was standing in the corner, his hands relaxed, his breathing perfectly steady. He didn't have a bead of sweat on his brow. He looked like he was waiting for the bus. 4. She stood up. She swayed, just for a second, then found her footing. The fury that had been flickering in her eyes ignited. This was humiliation. This was an insult to everything she had built, everything she had trained for. She looked at the crowd, then back at Bruce. Her jaw set, her fists clenching so hard her knuckles turned white. Vanam wiped her gloves, looked into her eyes, and asked in Dutch if she was ready. She nodded, curtly. The fight resumed, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She didn't want to win anymore. She wanted to punish. She rushed him, abandoning all caution, throwing a flurry of strikes, a low kick, a left hook, a knee, an elbow, a chaotic, violent storm of limbs. But Bruce was the eye of that storm. He moved through the combination like water flowing through rocks. He checked the low kick with his shin, slipped the hook, parried the knee, and ducked the elbow. He was everywhere and nowhere. He was in the gaps of her movement. And in those microseconds where she was transitioning between strikes, he was landing his own. A sharp, stinging shot to the liver. A quick, piercing strike to the solar plexus. A light, bruising tap to the ribs. Every single strike he landed was economical, devoid of wasted motion, yet devastatingly effective. They weren't meant to knock her out, not yet. They were meant to accumulate, to drain the air from her lungs, to make her realize that the faster she fought, the faster she would collapse. 90 seconds into the round, she was gasping. Her ribs were on fire. Her lungs were screaming for oxygen. She had landed a right hand that had grazed his shoulder, but it felt like hitting a ghost. She hadn't connected with anything solid. She hadn't used her weight because he wouldn't let her get close enough to grab hold. She realized then, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she was being outclassed on a level she hadn't known existed. She was a fighter of power, of size, of physical dominance. He was a fighter of physics, of timing, of absolute, unwavering control. And in this warehouse, in this secret match, the power didn't matter. The size didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the man standing in front of her, the man who was currently deciding how this fight would end. She looked across the ring, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't malice. It wasn't ego. It was an invitation. He was teaching her, and she was the only student in the room. The bell for the end of the round rang, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the rafters. Saskia retreated to her corner, her chest heaving, her coach hovering over her, yelling instructions in Dutch that sounded like background noise. She couldn't hear him. All she could hear was the rhythm of her own heart and the lingering echo of Bruce's movements. She sat on the stool, feeling the cold air hit her skin, and looked across the ring. Bruce wasn't sitting. He was leaning against the ropes, relaxed, his eyes drifting over the crowd. He looked like he was enjoying himself. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because she realized then that she was fighting a man who wasn't worried about losing. He was just waiting for her to understand the lesson he was trying to teach. The bell rang for the second round, slicing through the tense air of the warehouse. It felt louder this time, sharper. Saskia stood up from her stool, her legs feeling heavy, not just from the weight she carried, but from the invisible tax Bruce Lee had been charging her every second they stood in that ring. Her coach, a grizzled man who had seen her win dozens of times, was shouting in her ear, his voice urgent, desperate. But she wasn't listening. She was staring across the ring at Bruce. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like a man standing on a beach, watching the tide. Saskia knew what she had to do. She had been fighting since she was a teenager. She knew that when speed and precision outclass power, you don't fight fire with fire. You change the landscape. She needed to take away his space. She needed to make the ring smaller. She needed to use that 100-pound weight advantage, not to strike, but to smother. When the round started, she didn't rush. She moved with a controlled, predatory focus. She kept her chin tucked, her hands high, and she began to walk him down. She was trying to force him toward the ropes, to trap him in a corner where his fluid movement would be suffocated by her frame. It was a sound strategy. Against any other opponent it would have worked. But Bruce Lee was not like anyone she had ever stepped in the ring with. As she closed the distance, trying to corner him, he didn't retreat. He drifted. He moved in small, rhythmic steps, always staying just outside the radius of her reach. Every time she tried to cut him off, he was already gone, circling out, his feet finding the perfect angle. It was like trying to catch a shadow with your bare hands. Frustration started to bubble up in her chest. She threw a low kick, and he checked it, his shin hitting hers with a bone-jarring impact that made her leg tremble. She fired a jab, and he slipped it by a fraction of an inch, the wind of his movement ghosting past her ear. He wasn't just defending, he was constantly resetting her rhythm, forcing her to reset her own. 2 minutes into the round, Saskia hit her limit. She decided she was done playing the tactical game. She roared, a primal sound that echoed off the warehouse walls, and lunged forward, abandoning all defense. She wanted to clinch. She wanted to get her hands on his shoulders, to use her mass to drive him into the canvas, to break his rhythm by literally crushing it under her weight. She got close. For a second, her hands found him. She grabbed his shoulders, pulling him in, and for the first time, she felt that she had the leverage. She had him. But in that exact second, the floor seemed to vanish from underneath her. Bruce didn't panic. He didn't try to pull away. He went with the pull, stepping inside her guard as if he were being sucked in. Before she could transition into a knee or a takedown, he had already changed the angle. He delivered a knee to her thigh, sharp, stinging, deadening the muscle. And then, with a movement that was too fast for the eye to track, he drove an elbow into her shoulder. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was a reset button. Her arm went dead for a second. She lost her grip. She stumbled backward, her breath ragged. The crowd was silent now. They were watching something that defied their understanding of combat. The woman who had built her entire reputation on overwhelming her opponents with size was being outmuscled by a man who looked like he could be broken in half. Saskia was gasping. Her ribs, bruised from the first round, were screaming every time she inhaled. Her legs were heavy, sluggish. The adrenaline that usually carried her through a fight was turning into a thick, suffocating dread. She looked at Bruce, and she saw the same calm, unbothered expression he'd worn since the first minute. She threw everything she had left. A high kick, spinning back fist, a flying knee, a flurry of violence intended to end the night. It was spectacular. It was the best she had ever looked, the cleanest technique she had ever mustered. And it hit nothing but air. Bruce slipped the kick, ducked the back fist, and sidestepped the knee. He was weaving through her storm of strikes with such ease it looked like a dance. And then, he saw the opening. As she landed from the failed knee, her momentum carrying her forward, he didn't dance away. He stepped in. A straight right hand, clean, crisp, and delivered with total focus, landed square on her jaw. It wasn't a wild, swinging haymaker. It was a punch that traveled straight down the center line, perfect and efficient. The sound of the impact was dull, sickening. Saskia's head snapped back. Her legs, already pushed to the brink of collapse, simply gave out. She went down, not with a thud, but a total surrender of her body. She hit the canvas hard, her arms splayed out, her 240-pound frame lying still for a heartbeat. The warehouse went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the referee as he began to count. 1. Saskia blinked, her eyes unfocused, staring at the ceiling. 2. Her fingers twitched, digging into the canvas. 3. She tried to push up. Her mind was telling her to move, but her body was lagging, the nerves in her jaw still buzzing from the shock of the punch. 4. She made it to her knees. She was swaying, her head hanging low. 5. She pushed her palms against the floor, her triceps shaking. 6. She stood up, but she was a skyscraper without a foundation. She was swaying, her eyes struggling to fix on a point. 7. The referee looked into her eyes. He didn't ask her a question. He saw the answer. She was still there. She was still conscious, but she was finished. The fight had been drained out of her. He didn't wait for her to signal. He waved his arms, stepping between them. The match was over. A technical knockout. 2 minutes and 47 seconds into the second round. The room erupted, not into cheers, but into a chaotic, heated argument. Some of the men in the back were shouting about a fix, refusing to believe their champion had been beaten by a man who barely looked like a heavyweight. Others stood in stunned silence, their jaws dropped, looking from the unconscious pride of their gym to the small, calm man standing in the corner. Saskia sat on the canvas, her back against the ropes, her coach trying to put ice on her ribs. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Bruce. The anger was gone. The ego was gone. There was just a hollow, haunting realization. She had been the best, the strongest, the most feared. And in less than 10 minutes, everything she knew about what made a fighter great had been shattered. She wasn't looking at a winner and a loser. She was looking at a man who had shown her that her entire life's work was just the beginning of understanding the true nature of combat. It was over. But the ripple effect of that night was just beginning. The chaos in the warehouse didn't dissipate all at once. It hung in the air, a thick, swirling cloud of confusion, disbelief, and a strange, creeping realization. The men who had been shouting about fixes and conspiracies slowly grew quiet. They looked at the canvas, then at the man standing in the corner, and then back to their own champion, who was finally pulling herself up from the floor. The yelling stopped. The arguing faded into whispers. In that vacuum of noise, something profound happened. Bruce Lee didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his arms in triumph. He didn't gloat, and he didn't look at the crowd to soak in the approval he had just earned. He simply walked to the ropes, leaned over, and looked down at Saskia. She was sitting there, chest heaving, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Bruce extended his hand. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of the entire encounter. He wasn't offering a hand to a defeated opponent. He was offering a hand to a fellow martial artist. For a long, frozen moment, Saskia just stared at it. Her pride had been shredded, her ego dismantled, and the world she had carefully constructed, built on the pillars of raw strength and physical intimidation, had been revealed to be hollow. Then, she reached up and took it. As he pulled her to her feet, the two of them stood in the center of that stained, blood-spattered canvas. She was taller, heavier, and broader, but in that moment, the physical difference didn't matter. It was the mental alignment that caught the eye. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see an actor. She saw the master. She saw the depth of the void she had been trying to fill with brute force. With a gesture that shocked the remaining crowd, Saskia raised Bruce's hand. It was the ultimate acknowledgement. It wasn't about the scorecard, the rules, or the record books. It was the recognition of a teacher who had just given her a gift that would last a lifetime. She had gone into that ring thinking she was testing a man. She came out knowing she had been tested by a philosophy. Later, when the adrenaline had fully receded and the warehouse was empty, when the cold Amsterdam night had reclaimed the space, Saskia would speak to the few people who dared to ask. She wouldn't talk about the pain in her ribs or the humiliation of the knockdown. She talked about the way he moved. She talked about the water, the way he could be soft, then hard, the way he could flow into the gaps of her defense. She spent the next 3 years of her life in a different kind of training. She didn't abandon her strength, she refined it. She began incorporating the principles of Jeet Kune Do, the economy of motion, the interception, the fluidity. She went back to the ring, and she kept winning. But the fights looked different. She wasn't just a sledgehammer anymore, she was a scalpel. She never forgot the feeling of standing in that ring, looking down at a man who understood the fundamental truth of violence, that the greatest weapon isn't the fist that hits, but the mind that guides it. Bruce left Amsterdam the very next day. There was no victory tour, no interviews, no parade. The match barely existed in the official records. A few photos, later dismissed by skeptics as elaborate fakes, were the only proof that it ever happened. Without video footage or official sanctioning, the story became a ghost, a piece of martial arts folklore that sounded too impossible to be true. But for those 20 people in that cold, drafty warehouse, it wasn't a story. It was an awakening. They had walked in expecting to see a movie star get crushed by a heavyweight queen. They walked out having witnessed the death of a myth, the myth that size is the final authority in a fight. They had seen something that challenged the very core of their beliefs. They had seen that when you strip away the ego, the weight, and the hype, what remains is the simple, brutal, beautiful truth of movement and intent. Bruce Lee didn't just win a fight that night in Amsterdam, he left a seed of curiosity in the minds of the people who watched him. He showed them that the limitations they placed on themselves were exactly that, limitations. Years later, when people ask about the Amsterdam exhibition, when they ask if a 135-pound man could really beat a 240-pound champion, the details don't matter as much as the lesson. The lesson isn't about beating heavyweights. It's about the refusal to be limited by what others tell you is impossible. The warehouse is gone. The ring is long gone. The sweat, the blood, and the air of that winter night have all evaporated. But the truth remains. The fight wasn't about the physical damage. It was about the moment the student finally realizes that the wall they've been hitting against all their life isn't made of stone. It's made of fear. And in that moment, when the fight is over and the crowd has gone home, you realize that the real victory wasn't the TKO. It wasn't the applause. It was the quiet, terrifying, beautiful moment when you realize you have everything you need to change your entire life. Right there, inside your own mind. That was Bruce Lee's legacy. He didn't just teach you how to fight, he taught you how to see. And once you see, you can never go back to being blind. The bell has rung, the ring is empty, but the lesson lingers. It stays with you, long after the dust settles, a reminder that the biggest battles aren't fought in the ring, but in the quiet, empty spaces of your own potential. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we're still talking about it. Because in a world that tells us we are only as good as our size, our background, or our limits, Bruce showed us that the mind, if you are willing to cultivate it, to sharpen it, and to set it free, can conquer absolutely anything.